Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Uncharted: Drake's Fortune, originally released for PlayStation 3 but later re-released in the Nathan Drake collection for PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PlayStation 4 version. This is a third-person action-adventure game developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in 2007 for PlayStation 3, and it was later re-released on PlayStation 4 as part of the Nathan Drake collection in October of 2015. And in its day, it was very well received, with particular praise being leveled at the technical aspects as well as the writing and the voice acting, and with some criticism being leveled at more of the gameplay aspects. Which of course does bring up the question of whether or not this thing is still worth playing, because it has been a decade since this game came out. And it's had 3 sequels since then to improve upon things that the original game didn't necessarily do well. So let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here, especially considering that the PlayStation 4 version is actually remastered. Well, since I'm playing the remastered version, I did actually have to go back and take a look at side-by-side comparisons of the PS4 version with the PS3 version, and it has actually been remastered pretty competently. Now, the original PlayStation 3 release definitely looks rather dated in modern terms. It has pretty low-res textures, there was a lot of texture pop-in, they didn't have any anisotropic filtering, all sorts of things like that. All of that and more has actually been fixed in the PlayStation 4 release. This still looks fairly dated, don't get me wrong, but they have rebuilt the entire game with higher quality assets, and it ends up actually looking pretty decent as a result. The thing is, this still does look somewhat dated, but that's primarily because it's about a decade-old game. You would pretty much expect it to look dated, and it's a remaster, not a full-on remake. And of course, you do have to keep in mind that when this originally came out in 2007, this was actually very high-end graphics for the PlayStation 3 at that time. It was definitely impressive to look at, and it has actually aged relatively well, especially if you factor in the remaster's fixes. But then there's the weird things here and there, like the ridiculously over-exaggerated recoil animations, where firing a Makarov PM, which is absolutely gigantic in this game by the way, somehow has the same recoil animation that you would expect out of a .44 Magnum revolver. This is because there's a lot of animation reuse, which in some cases looks absolutely ridiculous, like in the case of the M4, where you reload it the same as you would an AK-47. Which just looks absurd because there's no charging handle on the right side of the rifle. I'm not really sure what Nathan's trying to grab onto there. This also brings up things like where they modified the MP40 to look different than it actually is supposed to look because they wanted it to fit the same reload animations as the other rifles and such. It just has some weird idiosyncrasies with those animations that really do not do it any favors, and in fact a lot of the animations end up not looking particularly good as a result. Now of course, as far as actual character animations and even the lip syncing goes, they've actually done a really fantastic job with that, especially for 2007. Everything's very smooth, it flows together very well, the lip syncing is pretty on point, which was very surprising in 2007, and even today it actually still ends up looking pretty decent, so they've definitely done a good job with that. And of course there's the large amount of detail they packed into the environments, which is definitely a lot more impressive in the remastered version, I have to say. But then we move over into sound design, and that's where things really get kicking, because the voice acting in this game is friggin' fantastic. Nathan Drake himself is played by Nolan North, and even though you have heard that voice many times before, it's hard to find other games where he does it quite at this level. His performance really does make the character come alive, and it really does help that all of the rest of the cast does a fantastic job as well. Especially considering that there is the difficulty posed by the humor in the game, because this game actually does have quite a bit of humor in it, and to pull that off you need some special direction, and you need very competent voice actors, and they do manage to pull it off quite well. The only real sour notes come from the antagonists, who have really awful lines. Now that's more the fault of the writers than anything else, because really the voice actors did what they could with what they had, and they should be commended for that, because what they had to work with, at least as far as the antagonists go, was often kind of cringy. It makes the antagonists come across as rather cartoonishly villainous, and when you get that thrown into the mix, it makes it rather difficult for them to be intimidating villains. But that's really the only sour note on otherwise fantastic voice acting. But when you move over into the rest of the sound design, things get a bit more iffy. The music is very well done. It's a sort of action-adventure orchestral score that you would expect for this style of game, and it works very well, but it's not really memorable outside the confines of the game. Which is mildly disappointing because one of the most obvious influences on this game was the Indiana Jones series. And If I say Indiana Jones, one of the very first things that should come to your mind is the Raiders March. It is an instantly recognizable theme, and the second you hear it, you instantly get psyched up for adventure. Uncharted doesn't really have a theme like that, and it's a bit unfortunate. That's not to say that Uncharted's soundtrack is bad or anything. It's actually a rather good soundtrack. It's just that outside of the confines of the game, you're probably not going to recognize it. But we end the discussion of the presentation with the sound effects themselves, which are decent. I mean, the gun and explosion sounds are not particularly beefy. They don't have a whole lot of bass behind them, and you really don't get this definite, yeah, that sounds powerful out of most of the weapons, but they at least don't sound like pea shooters either, so there is that. The ambient sounds are pretty spot on though, so they've done a very good job with that, and in general, the presentation of this game still holds up very well. And of course, the remastered version certainly helps out quite a lot in that regard. But here's the thing, it's not all about presentation. That can only get you so far. What really matter here, because this is a video game, are the story and the gameplay. Now, I don't want to spoil too much of the plot here for you because this is an extremely linear game and it is very story and character focused, but I will give you a general summary. The idea is that you play as Nathan Drake, a treasure hunter and thief who is trying to track down the treasure of El Dorado by following the notes left in Francis Drake's journal, which is something that you recover at the very beginning of the game. Along for the ride is the journalist Elena Fisher, as well as Nathan's mentor Victor Sullivan, known as Sully. And the basic idea there is that you're trying to get to the treasure before another group of treasure hunters that are trying to kill you get to it. Along the way, you do have a few twists and turns that are trying to keep things interesting, but unfortunately, they're telegraphed from a mile away. If you can't see the twist coming, then you are frankly just blind. Part of the problem is that this does style itself so heavily after Indiana Jones, which means that it does have quite a lot of charm and character to it. I mean, between Nathan, Elena, and Sully, you have three characters that have quite a lot of wit about them and will regularly say rather funny things, and you do have this concurrent vibe of, yeah, they're doing it for the money, but they're also doing it because they're genuinely interested in the history and the wonder that they're trying to unearth. But at the same time, you have these sort of action set pieces where Nathan is up against these other treasure hunters who are trying to kill him, and you have these gunfights and fist fights that you would pretty much expect. The problem is that while it does have the right vibe about it, and they clearly were coming from the right place as far as their inspirations go, unfortunately, the writing itself is just not sufficient to carry this thing forward. The plot itself is rather simplistic and extremely predictable, and on top of that, you have antagonists who are pretty much just one note. They're just not compelling villains in the slightest, which means that as far as the writing goes, it all falls down to the sense of charm that the characters bring, and that's just not enough to really carry the experience. But really, the writing being a bit weak is not the main problem with this thing. The main problem is the gameplay itself. That is what drags this thing down considerably. It's split between three different things. The first of them is the basic movement and platforming, which actually works rather well. It's very smooth, it's very fluid, transitioning between the various platforms works very well, and for the most part you're going to have no problems with it, except the occasional instance where it doesn't really read your inputs as well as you might hope. Which then, of course, sends you careening off into a pit and dying instantly. But thankfully, the game is very liberal with its actual checkpoint system, so you don't usually lose very much progress if you do manage to fail. And on top of that, the game does have a save anywhere option. At least it does on PlayStation 4. I don't know offhand if it does on PlayStation 3, but on PlayStation 4, you can save anywhere you want up to a certain number of save slots. So if you're feeling particularly paranoid about a certain jump you have to make, or you're having a problem with a specific encounter, then you can always just save the game right before it, and then you don't lose much progress at all. The problem is that the platforming is not challenging in the slightest. The occasional moment where it does act like you're going to fall, where the platform starts crumbling, it actually doesn't matter. You can sit there as long as you want and that platform will not crumble. It will only crumble after you jump, which means that unless you're jumping by accident into a pit or something, you're going to find that the platforming itself has no real danger to it. And with no real danger involved in the platforming, you find that the platforming itself ends up just being fairly basic, and while it's certainly smooth, it's just not all that interesting. The other two elements of gameplay that you're going to be running into are the combat system and the vehicles. Now, I'll talk about the vehicles later, but the basic idea behind the combat is that you have your fist fighting and you also have gunfighting. You have two gun slots, one of them for a primary weapon and the other one for a handgun, and you can pick up ammunition and weapons as you go through the levels, and it replaces whatever you currently have in that slot. You can also carry up to 4 grenades. The thing is, with the gunplay, it is your very, very basic third-person cover-based shooter. You take cover, you peek out, you shoot at enemies, and occasionally an enemy will throw a grenade at you, which means that you have to jump out of that cover to another piece of cover, or you can run up to them and start whacking them upside the face. Part of the problem with the shooting is that the only real challenge you're going to get out of it is when they throw a lot of enemies at you at once, or the simple fact that you're playing a third-person shooter on a console, which means that the aiming sucks. It's just sluggish and imprecise, and that's the only real challenge you get out of it, because a headshot, with the exception of enemies that have helmets, will instantly down any enemy that you come across, unless you're using certain ridiculously powerful weapons, which will just take an enemy out in a single shot regardless. You can also run and gun, which basically is just firing from the hip, and that has a sort of auto lock on, but it's not very precise, and thus you end up wasting an awful lot of ammo by doing that. And the thing is, ammo is actually at a premium in this game because you constantly have to be moving forward to pick up more ammunition because you can't really carry very much. And with the automatic weapons in particular, it takes quite a few shots to bring an enemy down unless you're getting quite a few headshots as well. But that's easier said than done with the automatic weapons because they're not particularly accurate. Oddly enough, the pistols are pretty much king in this game. They are very accurate, they have a moderate amount of firepower behind them, and they have plentiful ammunition, so you're going to be using pistols an awful lot in this thing. But even with pistols, you will eventually run out of ammo, which means that you're probably going to have to get used to doing what is called a brutal combo. This brings me to the actual fist fighting, which is accomplished with the square button and the triangle button. Now, the square button is your basic melee attack button. You can just tap that multiple times in order to do a basic combo. But if you tap it and then tap the triangle button and then tap the square button again with a specific amount of timing, then you execute a brutal combo, which instantly finishes off that enemy, and it also gives you double ammunition when you pick their weapon up. Needless to say, with ammunition being at a premium, this is extremely helpful. Problem is that you can still get shot to pieces while you're trying to execute the brutal combo, so it's something that you only want to do if you can manage it safely. Of course, that's all the melee system is. Either you're executing a basic square, 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 square combo, or you're executing a square, triangle, square combo. There's no real finesse or skill required for the melee combat at all, and when you go over to the shooting mechanics, they are just bare bones at absolute best. And considering that combat makes up about half or so of the game, that's actually a pretty major problem. It means that you've got platforming mechanics that just work but are not really interesting in the slightest. You've got combat mechanics that work and are actually rather boring. And then there's the one thing that's kind of the nail in the coffin for this game, and that is the vehicle sections. And honestly, I think that's better if I just show you rather than tell you about it. In case you couldn't tell there, the controls for driving the jet ski are absolutely horrible. It just careens all over the place. You also have the problem of not being able to aim and shoot while also driving, so you have to stop whenever you want to aim at something, which leaves you wide open to being shot to pieces. And if the enemy has a grenade launcher, then it's an instant death. On top of that, you have to constantly keep an eye out for barrels that will instantly kill you if you come into contact with them, so you have to shoot those out of the way first, and it just ends up being an absolutely miserable experience whenever you have to drive that thing. The only other vehicle section is a turret section, so that one doesn't really have as many problems, it's just that it ends up being kind of boring. And really that's the word that best describes the vast majority of your experience playing the original Uncharted, at least. All the best aspects of the game are in its presentation and in the amount of charm that it has, at least as far as the characters go. But despite the amount of charm that the characters have, the plot itself is nothing at all to write home about, and when you get into the gameplay aspects, the game kind of collapses in on itself. It's certainly playable, but after having gone through the game, I can't really imagine why you would want to play it unless you're just going back to it after having played one of the later games in the series and you want to see how the series began. It's a game that shows off a lot of potential for later games in the series to capitalize on, but this particular entry, it's just not a good game. It's a very weak one in most regards. And the one thing it actually does really well, which is the characters, including their voice acting, unfortunately is just not enough to carry the whole experience. Like I said, this has potential. It could be improved with the sequels, and I will be taking a look at the sequels to see if it did improve. But as for the first entry in the series, I really cannot recommend it at all unless you're just getting it as part of the Nathan Drake collection. But on its own, definitely skip this one. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.